In this video I'll be going over soldering irons. This is a big subject, and just like solder it can be a debated subject, especially when brand loyalty comes into it, but for simplicity I'll be talking about the irons I currently have and use. At the end I'll talk about some other irons and soldering stations that I've heard good things about. Before we get any further, let's talk about how soldering irons function. Once again I'll let Wikipedia do the explaining. A soldering iron is composed of a heated metal tip and an insulated handle. Heating is often achieved electrically, by passing an electric current supplied through an electrical cord or battery cables through a resistive heating element. Cordless irons can be heated by combustion of gas stored in a small tank, often using a catalytic heater rather than a flame. Simple irons, less commonly used today than in the past, were simply a large copper bit on a handle heated in a flame. As you can see, soldering irons are pretty simple. The ones with temperature control have more circuitry in them, but aside from that, it comes down to a heating element. When buying a soldering iron, you have a few things to consider. First, how much are you willing to spend? Deciding how much you want to spend can be tricky when first starting. If you're just wanting to try soldering or don't think you'll do a lot, then it's probably not worth spending heaps on a soldering station or iron. A cheap iron may have weird quirks, but it'll still do the job once you learn how to use it. If you think you'll be doing a lot of soldering, or maybe want to get into an electronics career and want to start practicing, then spending a little more could be worth it, but even then you don't really have to spend a lot to get a decent iron. As a general rule, temperature control is the best thing to have. It makes life much easier, especially when using both lead-based and lead-free solder. If you can get temperature control, do it. If you can't get it, that's fine. For general soldering, go for something around 15 to 20 watt for lead-based and 30 to 40 watt for lead-free. If you're doing thicker cables or bigger components with heat sinks, you'll need a higher wattage iron, 30 to 40 watt for lead-based and upwards of 60 watt for lead-free. The simple answer is yes, you should have changeable tips. Basically every iron will or should have them. If you somehow manage to find an iron without changeable tips, I wouldn't get it, to be perfectly honest. Tips are a disposable item. It may take years to wear a tip down, but you will eventually. And if you don't take care of them, you'll damage them quickly and they'll need to be replaced. When it comes to tip size and shape, for general work, it's completely personal preference. Sometimes you will need a specific tip to do a job, but by then you should know what you need. Even after 10 years, I swap between chisel and conical for general work. The size and shape of the tip directly relates to how much thermal mass you have. More thermal mass makes it easier to solder, especially bigger things, but it also dumps more heat into what you're trying to solder, making it easier to damage the component. Sizes for general work with conical or pencil tips usually around 0.5 to 1 mm, and chisel tips around 1 to 2 mm are good starting points. As for conical or chisel, that's completely up to you. Most irons will come with a conical tip as standard. These work perfectly fine for through-hole work and small wires, but bigger pads and thicker wires they struggle because of the lack of thermal mass. Tip to grip length is something that may seem unimportant, but it can be the difference between comfortable soldering for hours and fighting the iron and making a mess. It's exactly what it sounds like. The length between the tip of the iron to the handle. The best way to think of it is when you hold a pen or a pencil. You hold it down near the end, close to the paper, because it gives you more control when you write or draw. As you can see, I really am a fantastic artist. If you hold it too far up, you have no control. It's hard to get it to do what you want, and you make a mess of your drawing. Or in my case, an even bigger mess of my drawing. Unlike these idiotic stock images, you can't hold the iron down on the tip because you'll burn the crap out of yourself. The tip is where the heat is. The closer the tip is to the grip, the more control you have. You can use irons with longer tip to grip lengths, it's just a little bit more difficult. Let's get on to my soldering irons. The order of these is how I use them. First being cheapest but most annoying to use, last being best and easiest to use. This is just my personal preference after using them for years. First up we have this Tradeflame 21112 dual power 3060 watt mains iron. This is the most common type of soldering iron you'll see outside of a proper electronics store. These are very cheap and 9 times out of 10 are mains powered. They'll either be a single power rating, something like 14, 25, 30 watt or higher. They can be multiple power like mine, or they can have temperature dials on them for selecting anywhere from 200 to 500 degrees. The ones with temperature dials are rare. I think Hakko was one of the only companies to do this. This type of iron is okay for general soldering, things like wires, cables and basic PCBs, but for anything with fine pin pitch or delicate work they can be very tricky to use due to the size of the tip, which is normally quite large, and the lack of real temperature control means you can very quickly put too much heat into a component and potentially cause damage. These irons do have replaceable chips as well, but it can be hard to find them or they need to be special ordered. Best to check availability before buying. The downsides to this type of iron: the cable is usually standard 3-core double insulated, with the insulation being PVC, which is quite stiff and likes to hold its original coiled up shape, so it can be difficult to handle. Another thing is the tip to grip length is pretty long, which also makes it difficult to work with. If you want a cheap iron to get started with, this type works very well. They should be readily available at almost any home improvement store. Before I get into this one, I bear no responsibility for any damages caused by buying this iron. These are made extremely cheap and safety is questionable. I'm just telling you about it, it's your choice to buy it or not. Yes, you can even get USB powered irons, and I do use it a bit. It's a decent little soldering iron. It has limitations and very annoying quirks, but if you're looking for an iron that's cheap, easy to power and will get small jobs done, this thing is great. It uses a 3.5mm audio jack for power, which is a little odd, but it works. It'll run off any USB port or power bank that can supply 2A. I've personally been running it off a cheap 18V power tool battery with a USB charger attachment and it's worked fine. Because of its size and with it only needing USB, it's very easy to handle and maneuver around, much easier than the Tradeflame one. It also apparently has a vibration sensor which can be handy when it goes to sleep, although mine doesn't work all that well. You can also get replacement tips, but they can be a little hard to find and sometimes can be more expensive than just buying a whole new iron. Now it does come with limitations. The tip is tiny, which means it has very little thermal mass. You won't really be doing big joints or cables, but for small wires and PCBs it works perfectly fine. It does get pretty hot. Supposedly it has a max temperature of about 450 degrees, but I've never tested it. It does work with lead-based solder perfectly fine, not sure about lead-free. The annoying quirk is its power button. It's not actually a physical button, but a capacitive touch sensor switch button thing. Why is this button annoying? Simple. It doesn't always work. You can be tapping or pressing it and it won't register at all, which means it doesn't power on. Normally unplugging and plugging it back in fixes it for a while. BigClive.com modified his iron to bypass the button, but that means it'll be on all the time. This could be an issue if you run it off a battery or power bank. It does have a couple of semi-serious issues that you need to be aware of. Because it's USB, the tip has no real isolation from the power supply. That means this isn't ESD safe, so if you run it from a USB mains plug, it could be passing current through the tip and into the components you're soldering. This is because most of the mains to USB plugs have some kind of floating voltage because they aren't earthed. This could cause damage, especially on sensitive things like some LEDs, photodiodes and ICs. This is the reason I run it off an 18V battery. That way it's more isolated and doesn't really pass current. The other issue is the safety of these things. These are made extremely cheap. Normally something cheap that gets hot isn't the best thing. If you do buy one, always unplug it after you use it, never leave it plugged in. Of course, like most people, I have a Miniware TS100. These are extremely popular soldering irons for the simple fact they're so versatile. It has a bunch of different tip sizes and types, can be run off 12 to 24V, temperature controlled from 100 to 400 degrees, sleep mode, vibration sensor, and the firmware is completely open and hackable. It also has different coloured handle shells if you really want to modify it and make it your own. The USB port is used for the firmware updates, and the 5.5 by 2.5 DC jack is used for power. As I said, these are popular because they're so versatile. Being able to run them from 12 to 24V is extremely handy. If you're into drones or remote controlled cars and have some LiPo batteries, then you have a readily available power source for it, and XT60 to 5.5 by 2.5mm adapters are available. If you're just at your bench, then a 12, 15, 18 or 24 volt power brick will work. The tip to grip length is also pretty short, which makes it easy to handle. It does have some downsides. Depending on what voltage you feed in will depend on how quickly it heats up and how stable that heat is. If you only put in 12 volt, it can take about a minute to get up to temperature, but also not be as stable with the heat if you solder quickly or solder big wires and pads. 24 volt is much quicker to heat up and far more stable with the heat. The other downside is the DC jack. As I said earlier, it's a 5.5 by 2.5mm. That's not the normal size jack you'll find on most things. The normal size is 5.5 by 2.1mm, so you'll either need to use a 2.1 to 2.5mm adapter, make a custom cable, or get a power supply that has the right connector. Finally, the big daddy soldering iron, the Hakko FX888D. It's actually a soldering station, not just an iron, meaning the brains and power for the temperature control and the iron is in its own unit, not built into the iron itself. The iron connects to the controller, so you have a much smaller, lighter iron. Solder stations are by far the best choice for a bench, providing you have the room. The heat also stays much more stable than the USB or TS100 irons. This Hakko one, as far as I'm aware as of the time of this video, is still the cheapest big brand name station with a lot of different tips and replacement parts. It's also completely ESD safe. Cable between the iron and the station is silicon, so it doesn't tangle easy and is high temperature in case you burn it. The only real downside is its price. It's the most expensive of all the irons I own, but that's not really surprising seeing it's a big brand name and it's a station, not just an iron. Some other irons get an honourable mention. I haven't personally used them, but I've heard good things about them. The TS80 and TS80P are meant to be the updated versions of the TS100. They both have USB-C for power and firmware, both use Quick Charge 3 standard, which means they need a Quick Charge 3 compatible power supply to deliver the 9V 2A they need. The TS80P can also use the USB Power Delivery 2 standard, which is 12V 3A. Because these are USB powered irons, they suffer from the same issue as a cheap USB iron. Using mains to USB plugs means the tips pass current, which can damage components. Miniware thought of this though, and it does have an earth connector, but you need something earth to connect it to. Just like the USB soldering iron, I take no responsibility for any damages if you buy these stations. I'm just telling you about them, it's your choice to buy them or not. The Yihua Stations can be decent if you want a cheap temperature controlled station. A lot of them come with heat guns, which is handy for heat shrink or surface mount work. Some even come with multiple irons, so you can run 2 irons with different tips at different temperatures at the same time. You do have to be careful with these though, because the fuse can be incorrectly wired going through the neutral instead of the live, or worse, not connected at all. It's also quite common for these kinds of things coming from China for the ground or earth not to be connected at all. You can search or ask on places like EEV blog forums for help making them safe. There's plenty of people there that will help you. Other big name brands you might want to have a look at aside from Hakko are Weller, JBC, Metkel and Pace. You can't go wrong with any of them, but I haven't personally used them aside from Hakko. In the next video, we'll talk about extra tools you might need before you start soldering.